Thank you, Paul. If when I said to Matt that I agreed to do this, if I'd known that I was going to have to follow Paul Hurd and Matt Torra and Tom Patterson, I think the first thing I would have said to Matt was, really? I thought we were friends. But I realized that my presentation, this will be the time to catch your breath. If you fall asleep, I certainly would understand. And I'm going to talk. And one of the things is I was sitting here thinking, and I hadn't really realized that I'm going to be talking boundaries of Grand Canyon National Park and talk a little bit beforehand about the creation of the park in 1919 through legislation. But I realized there really is a difference, and I hadn't thought about it, between we're talking about either the Grand Canyon or Grand Canyon National Park. And they are two different entities. One is a golly, what a ditch. The other is a great national park providing all kinds of access to one of the scenic wonders of the world. So what I'm going to be talking about in a little bit of background is the role of Representative Carl Hayden, both in the creation of the park and also in the boundary dispute of, or not dispute, the redoing of the boundaries in 1925 and 1926. Let's see, here we go. For those of you that aren't aware, if you're not Arizonans, Carl Hayden, in my opinion, is one of the great political figures of the 20th century, one of the most powerful figures of the 20th century. Very few people knew who he was. If you have seen pictures of Hayden, you probably saw pictures of a much smaller man, not as looking as full of life as this picture, but he was a great Arizonan, and I'm going to talk about his contribution to establishing the park and then rewriting the boundaries. I apologize, I am going to be reading, so again, this is the time you might want to catch your breath and look forward to what's going to come after this. The ongoing and persistent irony of the American West is that for all its independence and frontier resilience and perseverance, it is the region of the country most dependent on the federal government and its representatives in the U.S. Congress. This was particularly true for the newly minted state of Arizona in the first quarter of the 20th century. And inarguably, no Arizona representative had more of an impact on the state throughout the 20th century than Carl T. Hayden. Actually, I learned that Senator Hayden did not use the T. The T actually stands for Trumbull, which was his father. His father was Charles Trumbull Hayden, one of the three founders of this university. Carl Hayden was elected as Arizona's first member of the House of Representatives in 1912. As a native Arizonan, he had a long and abiding love affair with the state and its wild areas. Before the turn of the century, as a young man, he made the first of many visits to northern Arizona and the Grand Canyon. It is no surprise then that as floor manager in the House, Hayden was instrumental in the eventual passage of the 1919 legislation establishing Grand Canyon National Park. As I said, I actually just gave this part of this paper a week ago, and for those of you that are academics, you know that if you can use something more than once, it's golden. So I apologize, but I am reusing some of this. In February 1919, legislation sponsored by Representative Carl Hayden of Arizona passed the House of Representatives establishing Grand Canyon National Park. In addition to Representative Hayden's sponsorship of women's suffrage in the House, also in 1919, the establishment of Grand Canyon National Park stands as a signal legislative achievement. The move from national monument status to status as one of America's premier national parks reflected a complex political ballet involving the federal government, the nation state of Arizona, its legislative delegation, and numerous localities and business interests. In 1916, Representative Hayden wrote to Willis Borg, the secretary of the Flagstaff Board of Trade, responding to the resolution on the establishment of a national park in the Grand Canyon. He wrote, "I am just in receipt of your letter transmitting a resolution regarding the establishment of the Grand Canyon National Park, and I'm greatly interested in this matter. In changing the present national monument to a national park, care must be exercised, however, that the water power and mineral resources of the canyon are made available for use." Hayden's response encapsulates much of the Sturm und Drang that went into hammering out the literal, entrepreneurial, and environmental parameters of the park. And this is where the whole concept of boundaries comes in. In 1916, much of the activity revolved around continuing to explore and garner support for the transformation into Grand Canyon National Park. However, in January 1916, the president of Flagstaff's Arizona Central Bank expressed a less optimistic view stemming from concerns over grazing rights. The Grand Canyon National Park may be all right, and it must be made, and if it must be made, don't let them take away all of the grazing lands of northern Arizona in doing so. Again, this states that, and this shows, again, the differences between boundaries of the national park and the canyon itself. There was a whole lot of interest at the canyon at this time that were not just involved with preserving, again, one of the scenic wonders of the world. Over the next 3 years, the concerns and interests expressed dealt more with developing and maintaining commercial, mineral, water, and grazing activities than with the establishment, administration, and preservation of one of the country's scenic and recreational wonders. Later in 1917, Secretary of the Agriculture Houston underscored this when he testified that this bill contains several features which are not usually written into national park laws, such as authorizing development of water power and permitting mining. As Secretary of the Interior Franklin Lane stated in his testimony to the Committee on Public Lands in early February 1917, in the very nature of things, however, the Grand Canyon cannot, as a section of two national forests or a national monument, be properly developed for the public benefit, and it cannot be effectively administered or adequately protected. What then in 1917 happened was the first of the bills trying to establish a national park occurred. And I'll just read very briefly from the beginning in the wonderful language that these kinds of bills were made. Be it enacted that the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled, that there is hereby reserved and withdrawn from settlement, occupancy, or disposal under the laws of the United States, and dedicated and set apart as a public park for the enjoyment of the people under the name of the Grand Canyon National Park, the tract of land in the state of Arizona, particularly described by and indicated within metes and bounds as follows to wit. And I still don't know what a meet is, and what follows to wit in the legislation is 131 lines of text delineating the boundaries of the park as established by legislation. Again, this obviously was before GIS and digital mapping. They actually had to lay out all of the townships and sections and et cetera that formed the boundaries and the construct that was the national park. It is an enduring feature of national park legislation that the bulk of the legislative bill itself will deal with setting the boundaries of the park. And it is the delineation and description of these actual boundary statements that incur much of the discussion and controversy prior to the passage of the enabling legislation. In early 1917, Representative Hayden issued a statement which would today be likely called a press release on the creation of Grand Canyon National Park. And he wrote, in response to a general demand that a national park be created at the Grand Canyon in Arizona, Honorable Carl Hayden has introduced in the House a carefully prepared bill, the enactment of which will accomplish the purpose. The area of the present monument is 1,260 square miles, but the proposed park will contain only 996 square miles, so that 264 sections of land that are now withdrawn from all forms of entry will be made available for grazing and other uses. It is the intention of the bill that nothing but the scenic portions of the canyon with sufficient area back from the rim to permit the construction of roads shall be included within the national park. Section 2 of the bill provides that the national park shall be administered by the Secretary of the Interior in accordance with the National Park Services Act, which became a law last year. Again, as you know, one of the things that really changed in and why the legislation started in 1917 was that in 1916 the National Park Service was created, and that ended up giving a administrative home for the park and for all the national parks. The Hayden bill fully protects the interests of those who have heretofore acquired property rights within the proposed park. Provision is made for the development of water power under existing laws, and the Secretary of the Interior is authorized to permit mining whenever consistent with the primary purposes of the park. It is believed that by the establishment of a national park at the Grand Canyon, the way will be paved for securing appropriations from Congress for the construction of roads and trails which will make the canyon more accessible to visitors. Over 100,000 tourists visited the canyon in 1915, a little fewer than, 3 million or however many million. But an even larger number are certain to come each year, particularly if good roads are constructed so that automobilists, I guess that's drivers, can drive along the rim and view the greatest natural wonders in the world. Let me see if this works here. There's the biography, and let's see where I'm going to go. I show this because, again, I for many years was an archivist, and this is me actually doing the research for this, and I realize it's somewhat gratuitous to show this, but I had such a good time. And as Dr. Hurt mentioned, if you have a chance to look at our 100 Years of Grand, our digital repository between ASU Library, Northern Arizona University, Special Collections Library, and Grand Canyon Library, I encourage you, because we have wonderful materials, photographs, and correspondence, and everything that I'm reading to you and talking to you about came from and is digitized in our collection. Getting back to reading here. In the statement that I just read, Hayden hits all the areas and issues that particularly appeal to Arizonans and presage themes and issues that continue to this day. Water power, road building, and tourism to Arizona were hallmarks of Hayden's 50-plus years in Congress. And now I'm going to talk about, let's see what we got here. Now I'm going to talk about, for those of you that are canyon buffs, this is one of the early incredible figures of Arizona and Grand Canyon, W.W. Bass. However, the bill in 1917 was tabled because 1917 saw the emergence of W.W. Bass, the longtime Grand Canyon entrepreneur, as the main protagonist of the Grand Canyon bill as written. He almost single-handedly led the somewhat tenuous campaign to have at least part of the Grand Canyon declared an Arizona state park. Think on that for a minute. if the Grand Canyon were also an Arizona state park. We're closing all of the rest areas. I can imagine what we would do if we had a state park that was at the Grand Canyon. Bass almost single-handedly led the somewhat tenuous campaign. In July of 1917, Bass wrote to Hayden from Los Angeles outlining his thoughts on a state park at the canyon. Regarding your letter in relation to the national park at Grand Canyon, I find that there is considerable objection to the tying up of the entire region so that there will be no chance in the future of segregating any portion of it for the people of Arizona. There is strong feeling that a certain portion not now occupied or utilized in any manner should be set apart for this class of visitors as a state park where provisions could be made for all of their wants. It would seem as though our citizens should have some consideration before this matchless wonder is entirely placed under federal control. There's a movement on foot at the present time to give us this consideration. The enclosed clipping will suggest to your mind something of the nature of this petition. Nope, I didn't include it, sorry. Bass was fighting a losing battle, however, on February 15th, the day after Arizona's statehood 5 years earlier. And again, today is 2 days after the 100th anniversary of the creation of the canyon. And let's see, 100 years, 14 days, and 6 years from the creation of the state of Arizona as a state. Okay. Bass was fighting a losing battle, however. On February 15th, Senate Bill 390 was referred to the Senate with its hearing occurring on March 21st in the Senate Committee on Public Lands. Speaking for the committee, Senator Henry Myers of Montana concluded, the demand for the creation of this park has been insistent for many years, since 1886, when first introduced by Senator Benjamin Harrison, and in the bill, due regard has been given to the rights of the citizens of Arizona and of the individual property owners within the park boundaries. The rights of Coconino County to collect tolls over Bright Angel Trail have been specifically recognized. One of my real interests initially was the whole controversy over Bright Angel Trail as a toll road. The committee, however, is inclined to the view toll roads should not exist within a national park, and therefore an amendment is suggested for the acquisition of the trail in question, which, as many know, did not occur for a decade. It is eminently fitting and proper that this magnificent gorge should now take its place as a link in the national park chain, which also already includes much of the nation's wonderful and extraordinarily distinctive features. I'm going to leap ahead a little bit and say that on the same day that President Wilson signed Senate 390, Secretary of the Interior Lane wrote to the Secretary of Treasury, in view of the fact that by the President's signature today Senate Bill 390 has become a law, I enclose an estimate in the sum of $7,500 to meet the expense of administration and protection of the park covering the final quarter of the present fiscal year. This estimate has my full approval. Probably some in Congress wish they only had to give $7,500 per quarter, but that's a whole nother issue. Thus, with the outstretched hand of the federal bureaucracy, the legislative quest to establish Grand Canyon National Park is both confirmed and initially funded. Carl Hayden, along with his colleagues in the Senate, inhabitants and entrepreneurs at the Grand Canyon, and Arizona politicians and citizens of all stripes, struggled and succeeded in their quest to create a national park at one of the truly natural wonders of the entire world. So by now you're wondering, when will he ever talk about the park boundary legislation of 1926? That would be now. This actually is the map, the 1917 map that was the first map used for setting up the boundaries for the park for the initial legislation. In the 1920s, much of what was occurring at the park involved the Santa Fe Railroad, the concessions such as the Harvey Company, road building, and the Bright Angel Trail controversy. However, the issues that drove the new boundaries revolved around grazing, among other things, land swaps, and access. The first correspondence in the Hayden papers dealing with the boundary issues occurs in April 1925. This first from the manager of Babbitt Brothers Trading Company deals with grazing. My dear Carl, we're enclosing a map showing the present boundaries of the Grand Canyon National Park. We have no idea as to just who is instrumental in suggesting this added area, but from the stockman's interest, we certainly object to the incorporating of the upper and lower basin of the Grand Canyon within present park boundaries. And one of the interesting things that we'll show in two more excerpts is that no one really sure where all this came from to actually redo the boundaries. Okay. Boy, I only have 1 minute left. So I'm going to just quickly read a letter from the the superintendent of Grand Canyon, and I'm going to show you a couple other maps. This is one of the maps in 1926. This is another. This is from the superintendent to Stephen Mather. Dear Mr. Mather, there are attached here to 2 copies each of the following maps. Blueprints showing alignment of Desert View Road, section of Supai Quadrangle showing proposed changes, and a special map issued by the coordinating committee, which you can see, commission upon which additional eliminations and additions are shown. The Desert View Road location through the Bugelin property was agreed upon at the conference on the ground between Mr. Bugelin and others. Mr. Bugelin agreed to this location. This is just to show that a lot of what was going on was not related to the actual press release that was given out. The Department of Interior indicated that the purposes of the transfer are to facilitate the administration and the national park and contiguous national forests. Lands required for the adequate development of the park road system are added, and lands not needed for park purposes are returned to national forest status. No lands in the national forest now utilized for grading are added to the national park. The committee has been advised that local interests most concerned are in favor of the changes. Well, yes and no, but nevertheless, the changes were made, and in February of 1927, again, for some reason, all these were done in February, Chapter 197, an act to revise the boundary of the Grand Canyon National Park in the state of Arizona, was put into public law. And looks like my time is up. Yeah. Thank you.